Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always say, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
My more or less annual Halloween lectures are usually fairly lighthearted, and you can relax. I will throw candy when I finish. But my topic, hijacking history, is no laughing matter. Today, interest groups across the political spectrum seek to monopolize the interpretation of history in defiance of solid evidence and sound methodology. This undermines historical scholarship, inhibits informed debate, and hampers effective teaching. This is an important subject and a big one, so the most I can do is offer some examples and suggest some solutions. I will discuss why history matters, the culture wars, the de-emphasis of history in the K through 12 plus curriculum, profiteering at the expense of scholarship, textbook publishers that jack up prices and dumb down history, and how popular culture sensationalizes and distorts history. This slide will give you the general idea of where we're going. All right, the fountain. This image is Cleo, the Muse of History, by the Baroque French artist Pierre Mignard. It's a suitable reminder that history is our collective memory, shapes our identity as a people, offers us lessons about how we should behave, and helps us anticipate and cope with a variety of challenges. Without it, we're like amnesia victims, not knowing who we are, where we've been, or where we're going, and we lack the basis for avoiding past mistakes and building on past successes. It's vital to the health of our democratic republic. It is what the ancient Roman senator Cicero called the witness of time, the lamp of truth, the embodied soul of memory, the instructress of life, and the messenger of antiquity. President Abraham Lincoln warned that we cannot escape history, and indeed we cannot. William Faulkner noted that the past is never dead, it isn't even past. We continue to be influenced by history, consciously and unconsciously, every single day. It may not always be true, as George Santayana warned, that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, nor can we always depend upon Niccolo Machiavelli's advice that whoever wishes to foresee the future must consult the past. Nevertheless, as David McCullough put it, history is our guide to navigation in perilous times. History is who we are and why we are the way we are. Or, as the humorist Mark Twain put it, history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. Yet there's always a risk, even in the freest of societies, that history can become what the Enlightenment philosophe Voltaire sarcastically labeled the lie, commonly agreed upon. The first great modern propagandist, Napoleon Bonaparte, derided history as the myth that men agree to believe. On an even more sinister note, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Joseph Stalin, and Mao Zedong falsified history, forced their official version on citizens, and made it the basis of virulent propaganda that deluded their followers and justified the extermination of millions. All sought to reshape culture by rewriting the past and silencing historians who resisted. Stalin even removed men who lost favor from historical photographs. Their modern counterparts, like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and Bashar al-Assad, also have silenced dissenting scholars. While this is obviously a worst-case scenario, it's a reminder that any monopolization or restriction of history is dangerous. Even with the best intentions, of course, in ideal circumstances, understanding history is a challenge. Sources may be damaged, imperfect, too scarce, or too haunted. You just never know. History is controversial, and often it is written, as George Orwell noted, by the winners. Historians are not omniscient, and none of us is purely objective or unbiased. Yet history remains both possible and worthwhile as long as we recognize that it is a work in progress and ongoing conversation that benefits from different points of view. But just as science is what it is, history was what it was. Good science and good history both offer the most accurate interpretation possible of available evidence. Still, as anyone who teaches in the Department of History and Political Science knows, it is impossible to separate history and politics. That can be good or that can be bad. In the Tower of Babel that is America 2023, people argue about politics and history using labels rather than ideas. Complex thinking, listening, and self-examination cease. If anyone says left, half the country stops listening. If anyone says right, the other half stops. Yet the last time left and right accurately described politics was 1793 to 95 in the Revolutionary National Convention in France, when the Montagnards sat on the left and the Girondists on the right. The meaning of liberal and conservative have changed repeatedly, as have the ideologies of the Democratic and Republican parties. The terms lack precision and require extreme care. This is also true of politically charged terms like anarchism, communism, fascism, libertarianism, populism, progressivism, socialism, white supremacy, and woke. I will now turn to the culture wars, beginning with a seasonal example. Today is Halloween, which for me means trick-or-treating, but it's long been the subject of an ideological battle in which fundamentalist Christians argue that it encourages Satan worship and witchcraft, while neo-pagans claim that the church appropriated the pagan festival Samhain and turned it, and then also burned some 50 million witches, which would have been the whole population of Europe. In reality, All Hallows, Halloween, All Hallows Eve, or Halloween rather, originated in the Middle Ages as a Christian observance on the night before All Hallows or All Saints Day, and independently of pagan harvest festivals. The Great Witch Hunt happened not in the Middle Ages, but between 1450 and 1650. There were, of course, no actual witches. Most people accused of witchcraft were at least nominally Christian, and the number burned was probably 50,000, not 50 million, over 2 centuries. And of course, any day now, the annual nonsense about a war on Christmas will commence, but we will leave that and turn to other conflicts that have a greater impact on teaching history. Consider Western civilization. Some culture warriors laud it as our greatest achievement and encourage universities to require Western Civ courses. Others blame it for institutionalizing racism, sexism, and religious bigotry, and urge universities to instead require critical theory. In 1987, Jesse Jackson denounced Western Civ as Eurocentric and male-dominated, then led a march of 500 students at Stanford University chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go." I will not support anything that rhymes. I don't care if it's left-wing, right-wing, in between. If they have a rhyming slogan, I'm out. In 1987, the same year, Alan Bloom published The Closing of the American Mind, a full-blown, entirely uncritical vindication of Western Civ, and neither side listened to the other. Lately, certain individuals on the right have invoked Vikings and sparked thereby a battle among medievalists. Rachel Fulton Brown, a University of Chicago historian, declares, "I am the professor your other professors warned you about. I love Christianity, America, and the Western tradition." I'm not sure what the warning was about. Dorothy Kim, an English scholar at Brandeis, calls Brown a racist and tells medievalists, because you are the authorities teaching medieval subjects in the classroom, you are in fact ideological arms dealers. Neutrality is not an option. Both argue as if Western European civilization is homogeneous and can be collectively admired and emulated, or held responsible for excluding non-Western, non-European, non-Christian civilizations from historical narratives. But it's never been homogeneous. There's always been enormous cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and political diversity, and even before the Reformation, a great deal of religious heterodoxy among Christians, not to mention enclaves of Jews and Muslims. So whether it's the ideal or a bugbear, the homogeneous West is a fiction. And most critics of the West live in the West, which creates some problems. The much maligned Western Civ courses address the ancient Near East, the not-so-Western Greeks, the multicultural pre-Christian Roman world, medieval Eastern Europe, which includes Huns, Magyars, Turks, Vikings, Northern Africa, Islam, and Western contact with the Far East, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Pacific, the Antipodes, and the New World. That's pretty diverse. Admirers credit Western civilization for everything good, while critics blame it for everything bad. Both are right. It's given us war and peace, oppression and liberation, exploitation and charity, hate and love, cruelty and kindness, though at the most basic level, individual people are responsible, not a whole civilization. In any case, Southeastern gives students the option of taking world history instead if they're happier with that. A similar good versus bad dichotomy exists with Christianity and imperialism. Critics of Christianity sometimes point out its irrational elements, fixation on dogma, intolerance of other faiths, persecution of heretics and witches, religious wars, and resistance to science. But, as defenders of Christianity note, it was Christians who countered all of those things in the early modern period. Imperialism excites much acrimony, and both imperialists and anti-imperialists are prone to one-sided moralizing. An editorial in the 2018 American Historical Review titled "Decolonizing the AHR" began long after the actual transfer of power from colonial masters to liberated peoples. The sovereign nations that emerged from imperialism's grasp struggled to shake off empire's hold on the national imagination, not to mention post-colonial and class structure. But if we consider worldwide, if we consider imperialism worldwide and begin with the ancient world, just about every people have been imperialist colonial masters at some point. But very few, unfortunately, in the modern world have been genuinely liberated by modern decolonization. If left-of-center commentators sometimes engage in over-the-top vilification of Western empires, right-of-center folks sometimes see themselves as defenders of Anglo-Saxon culture. But if you date American history beginning from between 1490 and 1607, you're talking about Spanish people, except Columbus, who was, of course, Italian. If you start between 1607 and 1776, the only thing English colonists in North America had in common with Anglo-Saxons was George III, who was distantly descended from Alfred the Great, but mostly German. Recent DNA studies show that the dominant ethnic type in Britain is still Celtic. Unless you speak and write Old English, forget about the language. After the Norman Conquest in 1066, the official language at court was archaic French, while church and legal records were in Latin. Common law is the work of Henry II, a French-speaking king descended from the Norman William the Conqueror and the Counts of Anjou. The origins of Parliament, the ancestor of Congress, lay in Magna Carta, which the English barons, for the most part French, forced King John to sign in 1215. Christianity was not adopted in England prior to the late 6th century, and English Protestantism did not exist until the reign of Henry VIII. The Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights, which inspired the American Bill of Rights, was the work of Parliament and the Dutch, William III of Orange. So there's a lot of people mixed up under the term English there. Doesn't mean it's not good or that we shouldn't be proud of inheriting it, but it's more complicated. That leaves Beowulf, an Old English poem about a Scandinavian king who aids another Scandinavian king by killing the monster Grendel and later a dragon. Fortunately, disputes about Western civilization, Christianity, imperialism, and Anglo-Saxons remain the subject of discussion in most classrooms. We talk about this stuff. But history hijackers are determined to shut down debate about American history, and in some cases they've been effective from both ends of the spectrum. Not surprisingly, they often focus on race, which means African American slavery, abolitionism, Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, affirmative action, reparations, black power, white privilege, white supremacy, and unending confusion, hyperbole, and misinformation. Black slavery existed in North America from 1619 till 1865. It was arguably the most divisive issue in American history, provoking crisis after crisis in colonial and national politics. African Americans were able to vote and hold office during Reconstruction, but that ended in 1877, and a flood of Jim Crow legislation soon restricted African American rights, and with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court declared racial segregation constitutional. So it remained through World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, in which African Americans served our country until the Supreme Court reversed itself in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which might be the same year I was born. However, de facto segregation continued. I remember the whites only and colored drinking fountains, segregated schools, and black men as old as my grandfather calling me sir. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 led to real improvements, but we have yet to reach the level of equality about which Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed. Yet, the study of African American history has made enormous strides. So why is there now an attack on teaching slavery, the Jim Crow era, and the Civil Rights Movement? Here's my theory, and it and $2 will get you a Coke out of the machine out in the hall. Since the Civil War, a portion of the white population has pushed back against African American advances. For them, the matter has become much more urgent with the recognition that Caucasian Americans will soon cease to be a majority of the population. The presidency of Barack Obama exacerbated this, though he was half Caucasian himself. Then the shooting death of African-American teenager Trayvon Martin in Florida in 2012 and acquittal of the shooter George Zimmerman in 2013 led to the creation of the amorphous and decentralized Black Lives Matter movement, which has caused no end of confusion. Alice Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi founded an organization called Black Lives Matter that now has a number of loosely connected semi-autonomous chapters around the country, and Cullors has indicated that she is a Marxist, which has raised red flags among some people. However, the movement is much larger than her organization, and many of those involved are not affiliated with it. So it's easy to see how people get them confused. There were Black Lives Matter street protests in 2014 over the killings of Michael Brown in Missouri and Eric Garner in New York, and again in 2020 over the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Most were peaceful, but some of them turned violent, and many people saw this as the work of Black Lives Matter. When President Trump's opponents blamed him for inciting the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, his defenders countered by equating that event with Black Lives Matter protests, which doesn't really cool things down any. Also around this time, Christopher Rufo and other critics of Black Lives Matter began linking it with critical race theory. More on that in a moment. But let's look at the other side of the spectrum for a minute here. Meanwhile, in 2019, the New York Times journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones began publishing the results of the 1619 Project, which many Americans soon conflated with Black Lives Matter and critical race theory. Although it won a Pulitzer Prize in 2020, it has serious problems from a historian's point of view. Hannah-Jones makes slavery the central narrative of American history to the exclusion of others, suggests it was responsible for the American Revolution, and makes other problematic assertions. This attracted criticism from a number of prominent historians like Gordon Wood, James McPherson, and Sean Willents, who soon found themselves denounced as racist, which is absurd. This is not the place to examine the 1619 Project in depth, but it is essential to note that Hannah-Jones has actively and successfully sought to have it implemented as a required curriculum in school districts around the country. Over on the other side, this provoked a backlash, which in 2020 led President Trump to convene the 1776 Commission, an 18-member panel that issued a report condemning the 1619 Project, offered an equally one-sided set of recommendations, and set about getting them adopted in school districts. Please note, Hannah-Jones is a journalist, and no one on the 1776 Commission was an American historian, so neither the 1619 Project nor the 1776 report is the work of scholars with expertise in American history. Since each side wants its curriculum adopted and taught to the exclusion of the others, both belong among the hijackers of history. Let me emphasize, I don't support using either, although I think it's fine to talk about them if you talk about them both. The one historian on the 1776 Commission was Victor Davis Hanson, quite an accomplished historian of ancient Greek military history and a former professor himself, who now mostly writes columns talking about how terrible professors are. So I'm not as big a fan as I used to be. Now, all over the United States, governors and state legislatures, backed by cadres of irate parents, are trying to ban the teaching of critical race theory in the 1619 Project, often in conjunction with such inanities as requiring K-12 history teachers to give equal time to the good side of slavery, and prohibiting discussions that might make white people feel guilty. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin not only banned critical race theory, but also set up a tip line so parents can report teachers who say anything about racism in class, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis famously achieved national prominence for spearheading the ban in his state, which went so far as to eliminate several math textbooks on the grounds that they teach critical race theory. I had a hard enough time with the numbers myself. So far, over half the states have either banned it or have proposed legislation to do so. The weird thing is that few people seem to know what it is, and much of the legislation is preventing something that was not happening anyway. Arguably, we're having the wrong conversation here. Critical race theory is the creation of Harvard University law professor Derek Bell, whose concern at the time that he did it in the 70s was racial justice in the legal system. It's been around a long time. It's not generally taught in high school, but in the law schools and upper-level university classes where lawyers and sociologists have been teaching it for decades alongside other competing theories without any controversy beyond academic debate. The main point of critical race theory is that racism is a social construct, not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in the system. In a way, it's hard to argue with that. Slavery, which had a racial basis, of course, was part of the Constitution, the law, the political system, and American culture until the end of the Civil War. Jim Crow, which had a racial basis, was part of the law, the political system, and American culture until the 1960s, although it was contrary to the 14th and 15th Amendments. Suppression of voting, which has a racial basis, is increasingly part of the law, the political system, and American culture today, though it's contrary to the 15th Amendment. Those are social constructs. Critical race theory recognizes that, but so does common sense. You don't have to buy into all of critical race theory to realize that this is true. I'm aware, of course, that there are some activists, black and white, who think white people ought to feel guilty about slavery and racism, and there have been highly publicized but ineffective demands for reparations to the descendants of slaves. But that's not really what critical race theory is about. As someone who's not a racist and has never owned slaves, I do not feel guilty about either. In fact, I'm not real good at feeling guilty about anything, though I think that if you're a racist, you should feel guilty enough to stop that. What I do feel responsibility to do is be a decent human being by confronting racism in contemporary society, and to be a good historian by teaching what actually happened in the past, regardless of how unpleasant it was. That's my job. To be sure, there are very significant problems with critical race theory, particularly when its most fervent adherents attempt to employ it as a one-size-fits-all explanation for history. That doesn't work. But such efforts have been largely unsuccessful. And what at least some opponents, not all, of critical race theory in high schools really seem to want is to eliminate discussion in history classes of the role of slavery and racism in American history. That's intellectually dishonest and a disservice to students in our nation. To be clear, I do not invoke critical race theory in my classes or my research, but I do talk about slavery and race when it's part of the stories, and I address tangential arguments like these. You may have heard the ahistorical argument that the Irish were slaves too. No, they weren't. There's not a shred of evidence to support that claim. There were both English and Irish indentured servants who agreed to a limited period of servitude in return for transport to the New World, but none of them were slaves. It is absolutely true that some slave traders in Africa were black, but the captains of slave ships in the Middle Passage were all white. It is true that there were some free blacks in North America, and that some even owned slaves, but the vast majority of slave owners were white, including all those involved in writing the Constitution and governing prior to the Civil War. And while not all humans of African origin in America were slaves, all slaves in Northern America were of African origin. As for the good side of slavery, what in God's name is that? What is good about losing your freedom, being defined as property, having your humanity legally denied, seeing your family broken up, and working in harsh conditions for no reward? Having the kindest of masters in no way mitigates that, and there's abundant evidence that not all masters were all that kind. Sure, most owners kept slaves healthy enough to work because they were an investment essential to agriculture, just like a good mule. But a slave master could mistreat a mule and a slave just the same. Now, this does not mean that white Americans living in 2021 are responsible for slavery, or that reparations to black Americans living in 2021 can retroactively mitigate the evils of human bondage. But we certainly still have to deal with the legacy as manifested in contemporary racism and racial violence, much of which is systemic. We also have an obligation to teach history as it was, not in order to make us or anybody else comfortable. Here, critical race theory may be of some help, though in some cases it isn't really. The history of women is similarly unedifying. Though women could vote in a few colonies prior to the American Revolution, by 1807 no state allowed women's suffrage. Women did not gain the right to vote until the nation ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920, though that enfranchised only white women, the 15th Amendment notwithstanding. Until recently, women could escape being housewives or housemaids only by getting jobs as nurses, secretaries, or teachers. Department stores created new opportunities for female employment after World War I, but that helped only in big cities. Otherwise, women who went into the factories during the two world wars lost their industrial jobs afterward, had few opportunities even to pursue a university education until the 1960s and after, and so were not in anything like an equal position. Where responsibility and salary are concerned, there continues to be a glass ceiling. And sadly, one can find the same list of grievances in the Seneca Falls Declaration of 1848 that the Me Too movement seeks to counter today. As with African American history, women's history has enjoyed significant success in academia and on the shelves at your local bookstore, and there's been a backlash. Some states now seek to ban feminism or feminist theory, which are two entirely different things, from curricula at all levels. I want to make it very clear here that I am not even remotely a disciple of Howard Zinn, but one does not have to be to see parallels in the history of the working class, organized labor, legal immigrants, non-heterosexuals, Jews, Muslims, and other non-Christians, and until recently it would have been necessary to include in the disenfranchised group Catholics, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and other Christians outside the Protestant mainstream. Of course, we can't even begin to discuss Native Americans without using such uncomfortable terms as ethnic cleansing. And even though I cannot discuss all of that in depth here today, it's the kind of thing we need to talk about in history classes. Closely related to the battle of censorious ideologues is the impulse to sanitize history. Of course, that means we should not talk about sex. But of late, it also means avoiding subjects that might make anyone comfortable, like, for example, the Holocaust. It makes me uncomfortable. It should make everybody uncomfortable, but we still need to know about it. Now, you might be thinking, well, I know all of this. Most of you are in history classes. Of course you do. You lived through part of it, and your history teachers taught you about the rest. They also doubtlessly taught you that there is more to American history than oppression. America abolished slavery, enfranchised African Americans and women, defeated Nazism and communism, rebuilt Europe after World War II, and gives billions of dollars in humanitarian aid to the underdeveloped world. We are not a bunch of ruthless tycoons or selfish narcissists. Moreover, you don't have to believe America is perfect in order to be a patriot. In religion, there is no true tested faith without doubt, and in civic life, there is no true tested patriotism without being honest about history. That is one reason why it's so important to present students with historical evidence and a range of opinions and let them think for themselves. It is fashionable these days to accuse historians of trying to indoctrinate students, but we could not do that if we tried. We're happy when we get them to read the textbook, right? But there are other factors working against having a student body and a citizenry well informed about history. And these come from the outside. One is the shrinking role of history in K through 12 and university curricula. Quite a few universities in the United States do not require a single history class among their general education requirements, not one. Louisiana does require exactly that, a single history class. Certain degree programs require more, but it's possible in many disciplines to earn baccalaureate, master's, and doctoral degrees while taking only a single history class, or in other states, none. This is partly the result of states, for political reasons, mandating a reduction in the number of hours required for an undergraduate degree. It is partly the result of a growth of specialist disciplines that squeeze history out in order to offer more of their own courses, but it's not a good idea. Another problem is the university, or the history curriculum itself, the K through 12 curriculum. In Louisiana, this has gone from bad to worse. In the last iteration but one, Louisiana required K through 12 students to take the first half of American history to 1877 in the 7th grade, in the second half in the 12th grade, by which time students had forgotten what they learned in the first half when they were under the distracting influence of adolescent hormones. I remember a lot of girls combing their hair in the 7th century. I don't remember much, 7th grade, not much about history. The latest curriculum requires students to take American, world, and Louisiana history concurrently in the same class without much in the way of guidance. This might be a good idea for advanced graduate students, but it's too overwhelming to be practical for high school students or younger. Even worse is the way the new curriculum deals with primary sources. In and of itself, the idea of having students read primary sources is a good one. Everybody should read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution at some point. But students have to read documents, often in archaic and technical language, without first receiving any instruction about background or context. The state discourages lecturing, and for Louisiana at least, it provides no textbook. This is on the grounds that there are no acceptable Louisiana history textbooks, but I am personally acquainted with the authors of half a dozen that would do just fine. Worst of all, though, is that the curriculum assumes that students can teach one another without learning anything pertinent ahead of time. By that same logic, I'll perhaps fly a jumbo jet this afternoon and teach myself. Please understand that there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of wonderful history teachers in Louisiana schools. But they're forced to waste time on a lot of pointless paperwork, literally read to the class materials provided by the state, grade students on how they move items around a computer screen instead of what they know and how well they express it, and use teaching games and other gimmicks that do nothing to increase students' knowledge. And they have to teach to high-stakes standardized tests, which determine whether students graduate and how much state money the school gets. They are rightly frustrated by this. Then there are the predators in the system. One type is the highly paid consultant who arrives with contempt for local faculty, a host of gimmicks, and a list of impractical and inconsistent suggestions that may be reversed every 6 months or so. Another type is the assessment specialist who helps you spend a fortune and waste whole years of your life over preparing for accreditation. There are highly aggressive history peddlers selling programs and gear to modernize, actualize, incentivize, decolonize, anesthetize, and ultimately euthanize your classroom. Among my least favorite are the grant mercenaries. Allow me to explain. Between 2004 and 2011, my department worked with the Tangipahoa Parish School Board and several other school systems to obtain 2 $1 million U.S. Department of Education Teaching American History grants, which we used to provide graduate coursework and weekend workshops for teachers that help their students dramatically improve test scores. It was a huge success. Teachers loved it, and we were able to provide instruction and training at a very, very low cost. Then the contractors moved in. At one point, I had a very public dispute with the head of a company that would provide a Saturday workshop for a small number of teachers for a mere $25,000. We were doing it for less than 20% of that for twice the number of teachers, and doing it pretty well. But we could not compete with their political pull. Their representatives began showing up at the annual TH conference, hobnobbing with the administrators, and walking away with most of the grant money. Perhaps the biggest racket of all is textbooks. Our current Western Civ text, depending on what configuration and how many ancillaries you get, costs between $100 and $200 a copy. Mercifully for our students, we have a textbook rental system that reduces their costs, but it means we buy in volume. And that means booksellers descend upon us with ravenous expressions and offer us all sorts of goodies it is not legal for us to accept. I have no idea how many times I have turned down an all-expense-paid trip to a conference on effective use of textbooks in Orlando. Now let's see, what's in Orlando? But at least we have access to decent textbooks. K through 12 classes don't even have that. National publishers bend to the will of school systems in California and Texas, often use writers with no expertise in history, and produce texts that are riddled with errors. Finally, there is the malign influence of popular culture. I love this movie, but it is complete junk where history is concerned. Filmmakers and novelists cannot resist rewriting history to make it better, usually by eliminating any subtlety and including more gratuitous sex, violence, and where possible, car chases. Weren't a lot of car chases in Braveheart. I've published 2 books and a number of articles on the baleful influence of films and television shows about Tudor England, so I know whereof I speak. And by the way, they make great Christmas presents, and there are only 55 shopping days left, so the pressure is increasing here. Add to that the History Channel, which at least used to show World War II stuff, which was great. Nowadays, it is mostly about aliens, the apocalypse, which hasn't happened, so I don't know how we do history of it, ice road truckers, and pyramid power. On screen, the history teacher is usually an idiot like Mr. Testaverde in Saved by the Bell. What's unfortunate about all of this is that our nation could be having a healthy discussion about race in American history and all the other things I brought up, and how we should address both our failures and our successes. But that cannot happen until proponents and opponents of critical race theory are willing to listen to each other's concerns, and the same is true with supporters of the 1619 Project, the 1776 Commission Report, and anybody else who considers themselves left or right, conservative or liberal, whatever. I'm an independent. But assuming you agree with me that there's a serious problem, what do we do to ensure that history is properly taught? First, and I don't know how to achieve this, get the politics out of it. Refuse to fall for politicians who demonize history professors, accuse us of indoctrinating students, and label us as haters of America. I love America. It's my home. Also, write, call, or email your congressman, your other elected officials, and let them know that you want education depoliticized, starting with him or her. Then read. Read real history. Read books and articles by both scholars with whom you agree and with whom you disagree. Talk about them with family and friends, face to face, not on social media where every discussion eventually becomes a brawl. Most of all, encourage your children to read history, to talk to you about it, to disagree with you respectfully when they think it is warranted, to disagree with others respectfully when they think it is warranted, and have some fun doing all of that. Show them it matters. Let their teachers know you do not mind a little controversy in the classroom. Stop using labels, and bear in mind that Americans disagree about how best to achieve what is good for our country, but still love America equally. So, God bless you, God bless America, and now it's time to reward you for indulging my long-windedness. I believe you know the magic words.